Oil and the Soul of Africa, a 21st Century Scramble. A 37-minute presentation made at the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom, Shrivenham, on the 28th of October 2009. The presenter is Professor Oyebody, a Professor of Psychiatry at Birmingham University.
You could argue that I'm an expert on psychopathology, which is something to do with how the human brain works or doesn't work properly, and some understanding of what sort of abnormalities might go wrong when it goes wrong. And I might feel far much more at home if I was speaking on that sort of subject. But nonetheless, I did think that hearing an African speak about the way in which oil operates on our continent, irrespective of whether he's an expert or not, might be useful, it might be quite interesting. If you sit at table with the family and friends in Lagos, the talk gets around to this sort of subject very, very quickly. And all I've done, essentially, is just to formalize the sort of things that people say. So I've just made it a little bit more formal and more structured and so on. I think I should say at the very outset that the talk follows this structure because I don't think you can talk about Africa without having in mind some of the things I'm going to lay down as a kind of infrastructure. So I'm going to obviously say a little bit about the Atlantic slave trade. I'm going to say a bit about the original scramble for Africa. And then I'm going to say a little bit about what the Niger Delta was like at the end of the 19th century. And really because even if you're only 12 years of age and you were asked about current oil problems in the Delta, if you're Nigerian, your first thought is that it will take you straight back to the 1890s and the British and the Delta. Because essentially what's happening in the Delta today is just a reflection of what happened in the Delta at the end of the 19th century. So we can't talk about it without saying a little bit, at least passing reference to it. And then I'm going to use Nigeria as a kind of example of some of the worst excesses of having oil. And then very, very briefly say one or two things about the other countries which are emerging as oil-producing countries on the continent. And I'll try and draw things together at the end. That stuff was used at the end of the slave trade in Britain as a means of getting the general population to recognize how terrible the slave trade was. But of course, one of the interesting aspects of the slave trade is that if you're on this side of the Atlantic, by which I mean the New World side of it or the European end of it, you remember that you were involved in ending it. If you're on the African end of it, they don't remember that very much. That's not to say that there isn't kind of lack of memory on the African end of it, because the people who made money out of it on the African end also forget the fact that they were actively involved. But keep in mind that the European powers were not only involved in ending it, they were quite involved in the trade itself. So starting from age 1505 onwards, 20 million people were probably involved over a 400-year period. About 10 to 12 million landed in the New World, and 2 million probably died on the Middle Passage. And many more died as a result of war on the continent itself. And of course, when we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade, that's a preoccupation of those of us who live on the West Coast, and the preoccupation of people who live in the Caribbean and in North America and in South America. But of course, there was a slave trade going on the East Coast, moving into the Middle East and so on. And I don't particularly want to emphasize this so much, but just to confirm that, of course, there are social and economic consequences because you had the younger people, the most able-bodied people, the most fertile and so on, being caught and taken across the Atlantic into America. And of course, there were political and military effects because of the degree of fighting and wars and so on that were involved. So we need to keep all that in mind. And shortly after the end of the slave trade, within 100 years of the end of the slave trade, you then had the scramble for Africa. And this is Lord Salisbury, which I think is an absolutely wonderful quotation from him. We have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot has ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where they were. And I think that it sums it up absolutely beautifully. You couldn't say it any better than that. And of course, if you imagine the idea that Queen Victoria thought that we'd give our German cousins Kilimanjaro because they haven't got very much of Africa. I say all these things because you need to know that people like myself who are African retain that memory, so that they're not in textbooks. They're textbooks for people who are in Europe, but they're not in textbooks for Africans. We live it. It influences how we think. It shapes our ideas of the world. It makes us far much more cynical of the political structures in the world. It means that when we see what's going on in Iraq, we're looking at Iraq through the prism of slave trade and colonization. So that our interpretations of the world are very, very, very much certainly influenced and determined by these experiences. And don't think that because I've written it off a slide, that it means that if you were to meet a middle-class, well-educated Nigerian, that they wouldn't be thinking this. They would be thinking it because it's what we were brought up on. That's what we were taught in school, and that's what we read in books. That's the angle the newspapers take. So quite important background. So that's a nice pictorial representation of Europeans pulling at Africa. And at the Berlin Conference, which was held in 1884, was attended by the USA, Austria, Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, and then a number of, in those days, relatively small countries, although some of them are big. So Russia is big in terms of geography, but in terms of its influence, it's relatively small. But you will notice, of course, that you've got Zanzibar. Why would on earth would Zanzibar be involved in a major conference of that sort? But of course, Zanzibar was regarded as quite a strong kingdom, which had its own colonies in Africa. So it had Oman, had Zanzibar. So that's why Oman and Zanzibar were involved in the Berlin Conference. And the General Act, this is the conclusion of the Berlin Conference. The Free State of the Congo was confirmed as the private property of Leopold. Imagine that. I mean, the Congo is the size of Western Europe. 14 signatory powers would have free trade throughout the Congo basin. The Niger and Congo rivers were made free for ship traffic without any questions. Nobody had asked the people who lived there. The international prohibition of slave trade. The powers could only possess colonies if they actually possessed them. In other words, the principle of the effectivity, so they couldn't lay claim to them. They didn't have their agents on the ground claiming that they owned it, even though they hadn't asked the people who actually owned it. Any fresh act of taking possession on any portion of the African coast had to be notified by the power taking possession and so on. So these were, I just summarized the general act at the end of Berlin Conference. The consequences were that by 1895, only Liberia, Orange Free State in South Africa, and the Transvaal remained independent. I think Ethiopia was independent. So you got all this business of trying to fix borders. I don't particularly want you to look at that in detail, but the important thing to remember is that these borders were being fixed with rulers. And these borders took no account of anything except for geography. Somebody put a line down the middle. And I think it's worth just exploring for 5 seconds what this means in real life, what it actually means in practical real life. So if you think of Western Nigeria, so Western Nigeria will start from the west bank of the River Niger as it goes out into the Atlantic and comes back up through Nigeria into what used to be called Dahomey, that's now called Benin, into Togo, and then moves into Ghana. Right? So think of west of Nigeria moving like that. And from about 100 miles due west of the River Niger, the people in that part are Yoruba-speaking people. And the Yoruba-speaking people are in Western Nigeria, they're in Dahomey, they're in Togo, and they're Yoruba-speaking related people in Ghana. And you can see that somebody put a line through a thematically unified part of the continent and just divided it up between the French and the British. So, of course, in 1960, when the Organization of African Unity was formed, there was an agreement by the Africans that they wouldn't go beyond the 1884 conference. So they accepted the boundaries as they were. But what's important, the reason for saying all of this is that they've got boundaries which are unstable by definition, because these boundaries did not respect the ethnic unities of the people in those parts of the world. Or if you look at the north of Nigeria, on the borders of northern Nigeria, which borders onto Chad and Niger Republic. Now, the people living on that border, on both sides of the borders between Nigeria and Chad and Nigeria and Niger Republic, they're all the same people. They're Hausa Fulani-speaking peoples. And they've been going across that border as long as human beings have lived on that part of the world. Because, of course, the trans-Saharan trade route, which would have come from Cairo, would have gone to Tripoli, would have gone down through Fez, would then go up to Timbuktu and to Gao, would then have come down to Kano. The same people, they've been moving, they're nomadic peoples. So suddenly declaring that some of them were Chadians and some of them Nigerians and some of them were Nigerians is a fictional creation of somebody else. It hadn't been negotiated by these people. So by definition, we were going to have difficulties probably at some point. Essentially, there's instability which is likely to result in some sort of tension. So that's Africa in 1914. You can see the different powers and what they held. And that's colonial Africa, which is more or less the same as we had in 1914. That's kind of preparatory work, kind of infrastructure work, on which we are going to start to talk a little bit about modern situations that we live in. But keeping in mind all the time that the preparatory work we've done has shown us that there's inevitable tension within the system. Why is the topic important? 30% of the world's new discoveries since 2000 has been found in Africa. Of the 8 billion barrels reserves discovered in 2001, 7 billion of them were found in Africa. It is expected that 20% of the world's new production capacity will come from Africa by 2010, as we speak. So obviously it's important. It's become quite important. And then if you think of it, if you think particularly of the Gulf of Guinea, the oil that's found in the Gulf of Guinea, which is the same oil you find in Nigeria, that you find in Cameroon, that you'll find in Equatorial Guinea, that you'll find in Gabon, it's very high quality oil. So it is described as sweet and light. And that's really because it has very few contaminants in it. And it's the oil by which we determine what the cost of a barrel of oil is. Because of its quality, it's easy to refine. The other aspect of it is the ease of access. So you've got these countries, especially on the West African coast, that the oil is offshore or it's just onshore. Therefore, there's easy access to tankers and so on. Imagine the oil in Central Asia, the fact that that has to be taken through terrible places where all sorts of conflicts are going on and so on. I've put in quotation marks favorable contractual arrangements. I mean, it depends on who it's favorable to. What I mean by favorable is the oil companies regard these countries as relatively weak, technically weak. Therefore, the contracts the oil companies sign with these countries, they are in the favor of the oil companies rather than in favor of these countries. And of course, the more recent findings off the coast of Nigeria and off the coast of Angola, they are properly offshore. So that even if there are wars going on, there's no disruption to access. And people think that that's wonderful. So you can have as much Delta people fighting in Nigeria. It makes no difference because we've got the oil. It's 100 miles offshore. And they can kill one another if they want, but we're going to have the oil because that's what we want. So there's that sort of aspect to this. And then there's the sheer speed of growth of the African oil production. And people tell me that's important because that's very exciting in the market. So I suppose if you are into that area of life, that might be quite exciting. So what I want to do is to take Nigeria as an example. And I will talk about some of the others, but I want to slow down a little bit with Nigeria. Here we have, that's Nigeria. The oil, practically all of it, comes from the Delta. So it's coming from that area, from the Gulf of Guinea. This is a kind of summary of what I'd said earlier on, to say that the impact of the Scramble and the colonial period is that we've got arbitrary borders, we've got illogical countries, we've got imposition of alien systems of governance, and we've got the politicization of ethnicity. And you have to keep all that in mind all the time. If I try and take one of them, so if you take one, that for example, politicization of ethnicity. So you imagine that we are called Nigeria, we've got 256 different peoples, but we've got 2 of the 256 ethnic groups in Nigeria, we've got 3 which are major. There are 253 others which are very, very small peoples in terms of numbers. So you've got some ethnic groups that we're talking 20,000 people. So you've got 3 groups. The structure of the country at independence, the constitution agreed and negotiated with Britain, created an instability in the system, which meant that the politics had to be ethnic-based politics. Because the way the constitution was written, it meant that if that constitution was what we have today, the northern part of the country would have continued forever to rule the country. And that is impossible. You can't tolerate that. I mean, there's no other country in the world that would tolerate that. So people wouldn't tolerate the idea necessarily that the way the constitution is written, that they will be led by a group of people forever. And that created instability in the system, which therefore meant that the politicians were appealing to ethnicity for politics. So that's a direct consequence of how the constitution was written. I know that it's played in the press as if that is integral to how these Africans are. But actually the truth is that the dispensation was written in such a way that these Africans couldn't be anything but like that. And I think that's quite important to hold that in mind. And finally, that they were illogical countries. Illogical countries in the sense that there wasn't any kind of unifying system apart from the fact that there was a border. So it wasn't that there was a person from the north of Nigeria who had conquered the whole of the country, therefore there was a good reason for everybody to be under that authority. They just under that authority because that's what the British created, so there was no other logic to them except for that. And of course that was all right whilst the British were there, but of course the British were no longer there from 1960. So there are problems, and all of these problems will play out as we look at oil. So there's a fragility of the colonial constitution, and because of the nature of the resources, there's a desire for the center to control resources. And that's to do with how the country is constructed. And then, of course, you've got the whole business of the Cold War and international power politics. And then I've already said a bit about the business of the kind of politicization of ethnicity and so on. The other thing you need to know, if you were a Nigerian, about how a Nigerian would think of these matters, is that this chap, Jaja of Opobo, who was a local king of a small area in the Delta, that he controlled access to palm oil in the 1880s. Palm oil was very important because the Industrial Revolution was just gathering pace. There was a tremendous need for lubricants, and the lubricant that everybody wanted was palm oil, and most of the palm oil came from the Delta in Nigeria. I mean, the palm oil now comes from Malaysia, and it no longer comes from the Delta in Nigeria. That's another story, but that's where it all came from. And of course, he was trading with English agents who were from Liverpool. And the desire of the English agents was to have direct access to the hinterland so that they could get access to the palm oil directly without a middleman. And he thought that they were making far too much money. They were paying him very little for the oil, and he was a middleman, but they wanted to cut him out completely so that they would have access directly to the people who produced the palm oil. And of course, that's the basis of the conflict between he and them. So he's invited by Harry Johnson, the consul, to a meeting. He didn't know that the meeting was going to be in an improvised courtroom. He faced the option of either the Royal Navy firing at his town or being arrested, and he chose to be arrested, and he was then deported to Barbados. His sheer presence in Barbados created riots in Barbados, so he was then moved to Cape Verde, and when he died, his body was later brought back to Opobo to be buried. And I tell you this story because when we are talking about the modern period, and we're talking about petrol, and we're talking about oil in the modern sense, sitting on that story of current of oil, as we know it today, is this story which is going on in the background of control of one's own resources. And it's coincidental that that also had to do with oil. It was to do with palm oil, obviously, not to do with petroleum oil as we think of it today. There is this, in the background, is this idea that military power determines who controls it. And that the people who live in the Delta have felt that they've been exploited, that their resources have been exploited without them personally gaining from it. So the accounts, the stories and the conflicts that we're getting in the Delta, it's not a modern problem. It's a problem which sits on historical material, which the people in that area of Nigeria feel very strongly about. And there were others, so it wasn't Jaja of Opobo wasn't the only one who suffered in this sort of way, because there were other little royal families in the Delta. So I put two others, Nana or Lomo in 1894, and the Nembe people in 1895. To come to the modern period, so oil was discovered in 1956. We've earned, by some people's estimates, $600 billion. Yet we're one of the poorest countries on the planet. It's a lot of money, $600 billion, since oil was discovered. And instead of it being better, poverty levels rose from 35 to 70% in the period 1970 to 2000. Over 50% of people live on less than $1 a day. And between 1965 and 75, oil-derived government revenue went from 5% to 8%. Actually, today it accounts for something like 95%. When I was a boy, my father was a meteorologist who was in charge of the Kano airport, and we lived in Kano for a period. And when we looked out from our back window in our house, we used to see pyramids of groundnut bags. They haven't had groundnut pyramids in the north of Nigeria for something like 35 years. That's not because they can't grow groundnuts. So it shows you how damaging to your economy the idea of having oil is. And this is just to show you that Nigeria is the 8th largest oil producing country in the world, and it gives you an idea of how, if we want to be self-important, we can start to look at maps like this, because it shows you in relation to the rest of the world where the oil is being made, but that doesn't tell you anything at all about whether we're properly rich. So what are the consequences of oil? The two major consequences of oil that the sociologists have talked about, one is this thing called the Dutch disease, now regarded as a Dutch disease, and which Nigeria is a perfect example of. Is the idea is originally used in relation to the Netherlands, And the idea is that if you produce oil in your country, you sell it for petrodollars, so you're selling it for foreign currency, that you have an overvalued local currency because you have large amounts of foreign currency, because your wealth is denominated in US dollars, and it supports your currency, which is normally should be weak, but your currency appears as if it's very, very strong, which means that you feel as if you can buy foreign goods, so you buy lots and lots of foreign goods. And because you can buy lots of foreign goods and it looks as if you're a rich country and all of this wealth is coming from oil, you have a decline in your agricultural sector, which has happened in Nigeria. When your decline in your agricultural sector goes down, then you find large numbers of people moving to your urban areas. You've got urban migration. And you have, for the first time in something like 1979, they started to have net importation of food in a country like Nigeria. It was absolutely, this is not Ethiopia or anything like that. This is a country which is fertile, yet it's having to import its food. And then you find that the guys who've cornered all the money, instead of investing it in their own economy, there's capital flight. So they come and invest it in Switzerland and in London and so on. And then you have overvalued currency with a lot of foreign importations. And before you know it, you've got indebtedness. So that by 2005, something like that, Nigeria was indebted to the tune of something like 37 billion US dollars. And you become dependent on foreign aid very, very quickly. So this kind of scheme, this sort of sequence of events is described as the Dutch disease. And associated with this is this thing called the rentier economy. And this is very interesting kind of idea to keep in mind, that this is the idea that if you're like a landlord, that you don't have to do very much. All you have to do is you just sit on a piece of land, you get paid rent for it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to work at all. And then the question is to think of what the consequences of that are. What does that do to your national economy? What does it do to your national psyche and so on? So you've got this idea that the rent dominates your source of income, and the income accrues to government directly. It divorces the government and its management of the economy from day-to-day needs and activity of the population. All right? Because the government doesn't have to do anything for its own people at all. It doesn't have to care. They might as well not exist, because it gets money directly into its accounts without having to do a single thing. It doesn't have to even breathe. But of course, there's a real problem with that, which is that there's a lack of reliance on a tax base. When I first came to Britain in 1979, one of the refrains I used to hear on the radio and on the TV was that the taxpayer, and I thought, who is this taxpayer? And the power of the taxpayer, absolutely wonderful. You know, there's this guy, the taxpayer. It really matters to him that these guys in Parliament are getting us to pay for their flats and getting us to pay for their whatever. You know, how dare they do that? Whereas in the Nigerian system, nobody pays taxes because you think, my God, why do we need to pay taxes? We've got all that money coming from oil, which means that there's no accountability. Nobody cares what the government is doing. Nobody holds them to account because there's a divorce, there's a gap between the people and the government. So they're not paying taxes, therefore they can't hold these guys to account. And there's this business that an allocation state wherein the government functions as a vast gravy train. So the whole business is there's a pot of money, it's endless, it comes in whether you work or not. It makes no difference to you whether you're going to be voted in, whether you built roads or not. And you make your patronage by giving this money out to your friend. It's a pretty corrupting system, if there was one, really. So there's a severance of the perceived link between work and remuneration. Young and educated people give up pursuing professions or starting businesses, and they seek petty government patronage because they've seen so many people who haven't worked at all become rich. So what is the incentive for them to work hard in order to make that wealth? And they've seen people come from absolute nothing to become mega rich overnight, and nobody asked them how they got it. That's not good for the psychology of the people. So it's a grab what you can mentality. Of course, all of this is happening in a terrible background of poverty. Even if you didn't have the rentier mentality, if you have tremendous poverty, the fear that the little you've got now is going to go away makes people want to acquire as much as they can. So if you then put that mentality of this insecurity in the base of a rentier mentality, you can see the desire to grab as much as you can because you're so fearful that if you're not careful, you're going to be like your father was. You're going to have absolutely nothing. You're going to have to work on a farm. You're going to have to use hoes as well. It's pretty backbreaking stuff. And who wants to be working with hoes? Pretty dire, really. So what have we had since the oil? We had a civil war. And people would argue, of course, that oil had something to do with it. So because, of course, the war is between Biafra, which is on the east of Nigeria, and most of the oil-producing areas is to the east of the delta. The whole business was to try and control the resources at that time, and that the involvement of the British and the French wasn't just altruistic. In the case of the French, the idea was they were on the side of Biafra, and they were hoping that the Biafrans would become independent so that ELF, as it was then, would have control of the oil. And I don't think anybody disagrees that that's the aim of the French. And I suppose you'd have to say that the British weren't altruistic either. And they were lucky that the people that they backed were the people who won. And of course, BP for a long time had quite a lot to do with the Nigerian oil. So you got the military, so the coups had to do with control of resources, and you got the politicians, and the politicians' actions are all down to do with the control of the resources, very little to do with how to make the country better. And then you've got all the growth of civil society and so on, which again, of course, is mobilized by factors related to oil. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I just very quickly use the names of the other countries to identify what I think are the main issues that you want to remember about them. So you've got the business of Angola. And very interesting, this morning I woke up and I thought, yes, I'm going to come and speak here. And there they've just got Mitterrand, Falcone, and their Russian guys. They've just sentenced them in Paris. And if you haven't been following oil, you may just regard that as a headline, but of course a lot of it is, well, it's all to do with oil. So you got in Angola at the end of the oil. I don't actually think that this is bad, even though I think those guys should be in prison. But I don't think it's bad necessarily. So what you've got is in Angola, you've got the MPLA, whatever the name of the other faction was, and they needed to end the war. And the other side, I forget his name, was being supported by the Americans. And the MPLA, because they were proper communists, they were being supported by the Russians. And then the Russians, the Soviet Union collapsed. So the support for the MPLA, the sitting government, fell. And they needed to end the war. So they traded their oil for ammunition. And there was an embargo on them being sold arms by the West. And Mitterrand's son and his friends Falcone, who used to be in government in Paris, and their agent, their middleman, who was some Russian Gaydama or something I think it's called, made the deals for them to get them the arms. But those deals that they did to end the war in Angola, the Angolans now use the same system in their transactions with the Chinese. So they're no longer selling their oil on the spot market or anything of that sort. They're battering their oil essentially. And of course, a lot of this battering is being done in ways which aren't open. So there's a lack of transparency. So even though I'm on their side for how they ended their war, I'm not on their side for what they're doing now to their own people. And one of the things they did over the criminal case, what was going on in France, was that they embargoed French companies from having any stake in Angolan oil fields, because the criminal charges in a bit like Saudi Arabia and business of trying to look at contracts there, and then you can't look at it because it's going to expose all sorts of things, and you say you can't have it. So the Angolans tried the same trick. Well, they did the same trick. They're saying that because the criminal charges was going to expose some of the corruption in their country, and they thought that there was sovereign, there's national security involved. If the French proceeded on it, that they wouldn't be able to have stakes in Angolan oil, which tells us something about the shady businesses that the leadership in Angola was trying to follow. In Gabon, they're a perfect example of peak oil. So they've reached the peak of their reserves and they're coming downhill. So Gabon is a perfect example in Africa of starting to look at what is the legacy of oil in your country. You're not going to have it forever. A bit like Oman. They've reached peak oil. I know it's supposed to be a secret. Nobody's supposed to know how much oil they've got or left or anything. But they've reached peak oil. So you've got to start to see, what is the legacy of it? What have you used it for that's going to benefit to your people? And there's evidence that Gabon hasn't done what it should have done when it had the oil, properly speaking. Equatorial Guinea, I'm not using the word privatization in the usual sense of privatization, because when we use it here, we usually mean we are privatizing BP or British Airways or something of that sort. But what we're talking about here, which is going on in Angola and Equatorial Guinea, is that the leadership, personal wealth, is so confused with that of the state. In Equatorial Guinea, of the 52 ministers, 33 of them are relatives of the president. They're his brothers or his cousins or his in-laws. And you can't tell where his personal wealth ends and where that of the country begins. So that's the privatization of national wealth. You start to treat it as if it's yours. And of course, Sao Tome and Principe, which is a perfect example of an insignificant island off the coast of West Africa, which, because they're likely to find oil there, all sort of people move in there to think this is absolutely marvelous. And they sign a contract with them, which gives them 3% of the profits of their oil. Even though Nigeria is a terribly corrupt country, oil companies in Nigeria get only 10% of the profits. And they're still taxed on that 10%. And we are pretty corrupt where I come from. We're not going to deny it's appalling. So you've got these guys, they're so stupid. They take their own personal wealth and they give 97% of it to an oil company and they take only 3% for their own children. I mean, that's crazy, I'm sorry to say. And they all tell us it's wonderful. It's favorable. Favorable to who? I'm not saying this to just say that the oil companies are nasty or anything like that. It's all to do with leadership. The IMF and the World Bank told them that this contract you're signing is unbelievable. They still went ahead and signed it, which tells you that the personal wealth is involved. It tells you that somebody somewhere is bribing them, and they've forgotten that they're not just them, it's a whole country. It's a small country. Everybody there should be a millionaire, given how small it is. And then you've got Chad. A sort of interesting things about Chad. When Chad found oil, of course, as you know, it's landlocked, so it's north of Nigeria. It's around Lake Chad. There's a bit of oil around Lake Chad. And to get the oil back down to the Atlantic, you have to take it through Cameroon. So there are all sorts of interesting things to do with Greenpeace and so on, how you do that and leave, wonderful virgin West African forest intact. But they managed that. But everybody thought, we're going to get it right for the first time. We're going to stop these nasty, corrupt leaders from having access to these monies. So the World Bank wrote a contract with the oil companies which said that the money will be going into an account which will be for the children's, grandchildren's, children's children and all this sort of stuff. And everyone thought it's going to be absolutely wonderful. But of course, as you can imagine, they had things like you can only spend it on health or education and this, that and the other. And then they had great trouble. Because of course, if you're going to be a mischief maker, you can't make mischief. So you got the leaders discussing and arguing over what was essential and wasn't. I think it was last year that the World Bank threw its hands up to say, this has failed. We can't control these guys. But there was a bit of truth in it. They were a sovereign state. How can bankers be determining how a country should spend its money? But of course, that situation arose because you had your responsible leaders. And then, of course, we've got Sudan, which is a fascinating one as we speak, isn't it? You've got civil war, practically. You've got horrendous human rights abuses. China is involved in Angola, it's involved in Nigeria, and I'm sure it's involved in Chad, I know, but its most prominent involvement is in the Sudan. And the issues to do with involvements which are, if you wish, with no strings tied, and involvements which the West wish to have, which have strings attached. I want to end here, and this is where I feel most unsafe. I'm not going to take you through each of this in turn, but you can't be a West African and not be interested in the fact that there's a gradual increasing military build-up on your doorstep. And we know it. We're not stupid or blind. We think to ourselves, we've been lucky for 100 years or so, maybe for about 50 of the last 100 years, where we've been left a little bit to our devices, where we haven't had too much involvement in what's going on. I mean, you might think there's been a lot, but compared to quite a lot of the rest of the world, it's not like the Soviet Union getting into Czechoslovakia and messing it all up and so on. So there's been kind of a light touch since about 1960. So there's a lot of anxiety about this business that the Americans at the end of the Cold War, the American European High Command has very little work to do. It's then starting to look for work to do, and they rename Africa as part of Europe, and I didn't know we were part of Europe. I thought we were called Africa. And then they got all sort of interesting people like Mauritania and so on to help them to stop a bit of smuggling going on in their countries and so on. And then the next phase, of course, was to approach Principe, and I remember it as Fernando Post. I can never remember what it's called properly. To get those countries to start to have listening devices on their territory to look out to Africa. And of course, I'm not disputing the need for American security or anything of that sort. I think the worry that we have is that we will become destabilized because it's easier to extract our resources if we're destabilized. So if you're an African, West African, and you're sitting there and you know how to read the world, you are happier when nobody's worrying so much about you. They might complain about corruption of your governments and so on. But you are more worried if they start to want to have a base on you because you start to think these are really powerful countries. What do they want a base in my country for? How will that influence us and so on? And things are bad enough as they are. put the arm imports in to show you how developed world, obviously you don't need to import arms because you can make them, but actually the truth is that a lot of it is being sold to poor countries, and there's a lot of war in these parts of the world. And I think we could do without having a kind of gradual build-up. And you can look at the war deaths and so on. So that's the genuine anxiety that people have. So to try and draw it to a close, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people will say that oil hasn't been a blessing to us, that it's been like a curse. And that these new African countries that are discovering oil, the real challenge is whether the oil can be a blessing rather than be a curse. I don't want to be as negative as a lot of people are about oil in a place like Nigeria, because of course somebody like me, educated on the back of oil, and there are large numbers of people like me, so that we do agree that there have been corrupt practices, we do agree that there's been bad leadership, we do agree that we could be in a better place than we are now. But I don't think it's as unadulterated negativity as it's expressed. The sheer number, and the other Africans in the room would know that this is true, the sheer number of universities in Nigeria, the sheer number of people going through these systems and institutions, incredible, absolutely incredible. But it could be better. And we are harsher on our leaders than foreigners are. And the other last thing I want to say is that the face we show to the world is as if the whole country is corrupt. But that's complete rubbish, obviously. Common sense tells us that that isn't true. But that's not to say that things can't be better than they are.
Professor Oyebody can be contacted by email at o.a.obody, spelt Oscar Yankee Echo Bravo Oscar Delta Echo, at bham, spelt Bravo Hotel Alpha Mike, .ac.uk. Please note that any views expressed in this presentation are entirely and solely those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official thinking and policy of their organisation, Her Majesty's Government, or the Ministry of Defence.